Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Jaden Omega, a passionate raider, tank enthusiast, and Dark Knight main by heart. In this video, we'll talk a little about mitigation with the main focus on tanks, how important it is to plan it properly, the impact it has on the whole group, as well as some tips on making a plan during prog, and how to improve. A proper mid plan for yourself and the group plays an important role in progression, and it is very noticeable during the early days of prog. My main focus in this video is to help new players, but veterans might find something useful too. Also, if you're enjoying my content, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more future content and to support my channel. I greatly appreciate every single one of you who supports my channel by commenting the videos, by watching it, by subscribing, and for anything you guys do. All this amazing support actually gives me motivation and energy to keep making content, and I greatly appreciate it. The discussion in this video is part of my series about a tank role in a raid environment, discussing how it does matter and helping you improve in it. As Final Fantasy XIV is a multiplayer game, the hardest content in the game is a group content. It does require teamwork for success, so this video is more about how personal responsibility can affect the whole thing, and it doesn't only apply to the current Savage tier, but it also applies to Ultimates, which are considered the hardest content in the game, to the new player-friendly content, and everything that's going to be released in the future. Since Abyssos was released, I've been talking to multiple friends, from the most hardcore players to people who prefer to use Party Finder and raid when they have time. From all these discussions, there has been multiple mentions of how tanks die quite often to busters and dot ticks, as well DPS and healers just getting one shot from raid wides. The question, is it healing or mitigation, was asked many times, and after looking at multiple sources like the logs, plus my personal experience, we did get to the conclusion that most times the party just forgets to mitigate. But it's more noticeable on the tanks, because the tanks are supposed to survive the most, but then they get one shot. And that's not supposed to happen unless they get hit by something they are not supposed to, or they haven't used mitigation. Sometimes you will say, but I used Rampart and died, or I used Sheltron or the equivalent for the other jobs and I still died, I don't think I'm enough geared. The question here would be, are we proper geared for the content? Do I have to use more than just single defensive? The answer is yes for both. In the case of the gear, it is perfectly fine if you are using the current crafted gear or a little lower than that for the first two encounters. Of course, having extra gear will help you survive, but it won't do miracles. As everything in the game gets progressively easier with the extra gear you obtain each week from tomes and raiding, it's not different with survivability because it does get easier, but not to the point where you cannot just press any button and be fine. You do get more health and defense, both physical and magical, but that does not change the fact that tank busters, raid wides, and auto attacks do hurt a lot, and you still need to use some mitigation for them. As example, the moment you get that extra health from gear, you may be able to move some cooldowns around or remove shields from certain raid wides, but that doesn't mean it applies to every case and you should just stop using mid period. The busters are still going to chunk your health, autos are slowly going to kill you, and the bleeds are going to hit you for 40% of your health per tick if you have no mitigation up. And again, having a proper mid plan and executing it is way more important and impactful than having gear, and a full crafted tank can survive better than a tank in full raid gear if they use their mid properly. To put this in a better perspective, I'll give many examples about this, but before, let's talk about something important. The optimization of personal and party mitigation does reflect not only on your survivability, but it does reflect on party survivability and how healers have to play, because it will tell if they have to GCD heal more or GCD heal less, or if they can use their OGCD more optimal, instead of having to burn them to actively heal a non-mitigated hit or to recover from people dying. The healer optimization contributes to their DPS, which is important and comes into play when you are pushing for the early clear of an encounter with a hard DPS check, and it can decide if you clear the encounter or not. As an example, when you wipe at 0.1% but you don't have your healer DPS optimized. Which in this case, the extra DPS that the healers get are way more than the 0.1% that you just wiped to. It does happen a lot where the first people to be blamed for tank deaths or even the DPS are usually the healers, but sometimes there's not much they could have done to save you when you had every cooldown available and didn't use it, or you were out of range of heals when you could have been closer. Mid-plan and knowing when you should use your cooldowns come with experience, discussion with the team for the party-wide cooldowns, and pulling the boss. So if you just started learning how to tank in Final Fantasy XIV recently, there are high chances you are not going to be perfect, end up messing up busters and opportunities to mitigate autos and raid-wides. The more experience you get with the game, the easier it gets to make plans and optimizing them. This is mostly for newer tanks, but usually the damage from busters and raid-wides, they either snapshot at the end of a cast bar in case there is one, or some animation before the damage goes out. In the case of the dots, bleeds, windburn, their damage dealt per tick will snapshot with the mitigation we used when it was applied, so if the buster applies a bleed, every mitigation you had up at the time will help reduce the damage dealt by each one of the ticks. Now, I am going to examples. If you use your Invuln during Chalic Synergy to take it solo, you have no mitigation up for that as an example. The dot will tick for roughly 40,000, and considering that tanks usually have 90,000 to 100,000 health depending on their gear, there are high chances you are going to be dead after Invuln is gone, considering the dot ticks every 3 seconds, and it's also very difficult for the healers to keep you up at that point because you're going to be taking autos at the same time. This also applies to every single tank buster in this raid tier and in the game that has a dot attached to it. If a situation like this happens, where you die because you didn't use mid, you should not blame the healers for the tank death, because that's not their fault. If you use mitigation for the Chalic Synergy as an example, you are going to reduce the amount of damage taken by the initial hit and the ticks. If you use Rampart, Reprisal, and Ablation, and you can have some body mids, but as an example on Dark Knight, you don't want too many because of the Living Dead proc, because if you have too much mid, your Living Dead's never gonna pop. The bleed also is going to hit you for way less than what it would hit if you didn't use any mitigation, and you still use your invuln. And you save your 30% for the next buster if you need, and some other cooldowns. You can do something similar for condensed busters in P7, where you always use TBN, Reprisal, Oblation, Dark Mind, Buddy Mids from healers and your co-tank, and alternate Rampart and Shadow Wall for every single one, and you don't have to use invuln, and you're not gonna be in danger of dying. And this is also possible to be done on other tanks. I usually show Dark Knight because that's what I play the most. And you also don't need to have too much eye level to do this. I'm able to do in full crafted tank. But the healer could have healed me. Stop glaring and heal me! Like I said, they can try to, but it's going to be very difficult to keep the tank up when there was no mitigation, especially if healers were not ready for that, and they see the tank just drop low and take massive amount of damage from the dot tick. The healers can try with GCD heal and using a lot of resources, but that's not the best because they could use their cooldowns for another source of damage or mechanics that actually require more healing, and you still have all your cooldowns not being used. When you start seeing enrages, all of this comes into play since everyone needs to optimize to beat it. When we look back and think about it, this issue with mids hasn't been recent in the game, but it did become more noticeable recently because the previous raid tier at Fidelis wasn't a super punishing raid tier for missing mids like in both personal and party, except in Curtain Call and in Phoenix at the end after Flame of Asphodelos. Buster didn't have a bleed attached to it except for one Hesperus 2, where most tanks just used the invuln and took both bleeds, and it didn't stack, so it didn't just insta-kill the tank. In most cases, you would drop low from the tank buster but still live even with little mids. But because there was no bleed, you wouldn't just die over time right after. Except from the auto attacks still hurting you, which in that case, a lot of times it was salvageable. Abyssos is a raid tier where tank busters and raid wides are very punishing if you don't use proper mitigation due to them hitting hard, and they also apply a bleed. Sometimes they hit more than your HP bar without mids if you have low item level. There is a massive gap in the damage taken in the encounters if you are using your toolkit to mitigate, and that contributes for the success of the group because you are not going to be randomly losing people or losing even the tanks or anyone to raid wides and tank busters. Like I mentioned before, as a tank, sometimes you're gonna take a buster with a bleed and then you're gonna take a raid wide that's going to apply a second dot or do massive damage, and everyone else is also going to take damage, and you're gonna take auto attacks, and that is going to be enough to kill you if you don't use your mitigation properly. And I mean both party cooldowns and personal cooldowns in this case, which that is party responsibility as well. which in this case, if someone missed mitigation or is out of range for heals, the healers can't just babysit one person all the time, otherwise other people are going to start dying and that's going to result in a wipe later on. Again, I've talked so much about how important having a mid plan is and all the problems that come with if you don't use it properly and don't have a plan, but I haven't talked about how to make a plan and how to start thinking about making one if you're new to that. And since my main objective with this video is to help you, tank player, to learn how to make mitigation plans or to optimize them, I'm gonna go into it. I'm going to explain how I usually approach it. I am mainly going to talk about personal mitigation as your reprisal, and 90 seconds are usually going to be coordinated with your co-tank and the rest of the party in most cases. Sometimes healers are going to ask you to move it somewhere else due to certain parts having too much and others be missing mitigation, plus the healer optimization that I mentioned before. And your personal cooldowns are usually not going to change much from week 1 to month 3 if you already have them optimized. But party cooldowns have a chance to be moved around to make it more optimal for your healers, since the extra gear will allow less healing and better party survivability and a better optimization. You can also make a spreadsheet to help you with planning or make a copy from the one of the many available on the Balanced Discord server. These spreadsheets you can get in there are usually very useful, and they have the timeline of the whole encounter with raid-wise, busters and all the mechanics, which can help you and the team figure out the best and most optimal use of your cooldowns. And I would say that spreadsheets are actually essential for prog, especially in Ultimate and Week 1 Savage. Usually in Savage, due to the gear progression, you will end up optimizing everything with the party to allow less healing and a better party gameplay. In Ultimates, you really can't remove a lot of the GCD healing and the necessary parts, with the only way being optimizing mitigation to the best possible, where you can sometimes remove a few GCD shields or GCD heals, and that's due to Ultimate not having a real gear progression. The way I usually approach my personal mid plan is by figuring out the timeline of the encounter as I pull, where I first try to figure out how often are the busters so I can make sure I have at least Rampart or 30% plus short cooldowns and other free mitigations available. After that, I try to fit extra usages of my mitigation with short cooldown during parts where I take multiple autos or raid-wise with bleeds, or the party's taking a lot of damage where I try to give my mitigation to someone else. To remember some of the points where I use mid, to me, it's easier to keep track of the timeline of the encounter by the mechanic timing, which they always will happen around the same time, or using a cooldown of something with a really long cooldown or that I use always at the same time, like my 2 minutes. I know as an example I use my Living Shadow always at the same time, so if there is a buster that always happens when my Living Shadow is at 10 seconds from coming off cooldown, and I know I'm gonna take autos at 45 seconds before that, I can plan some extra uses of my 25 seconds. In this case, I can even pre-pop some of my long cooldowns in case they line up with burst, or if I have to weave multiple cooldowns plus party mitigation at the same time. As you have probably noticed by now, using invulns, just invuln no mid, is a bad option for tank busters this raid tier, with exception of the buster in Abyssos 2, because that buster does not have a dot attached to it. But it doesn't mean you should not use invulns for the tank busters in Ultimates, or even in future content when it's being released. It will all depend if it's a multi-hit buster, a single hit buster that hits super hard, or if it has a dot attached to it. As you have probably noticed, a lot of the tank busters and raid wides in the Abyssos raid tier, they line up with your bursts, and it can get really annoying and frustrating if you are new to tanking, and sometimes you're not gonna know what you are supposed to do in this case. At first, while you're getting used to it, I recommend just delaying your burst so you can use your mid, but once you know the timings, you can mostly pre-pop your mitigation so it gets the hard hitting busters and you can still do your burst normally. This will affect every single one of the tank jobs, but it is worse for Dark Knight and Gunbreaker due to their burst window being very active. There are the cases where everyone takes damage, and using tank mid on other party members can help a lot. As an example, natural alignment and purgation for the Abyssos raid tier. In the case of natural alignment, you are using your tank mitigation to give shield and regens to people, due to the dot being applied before. In the case of Purgation, you can actually use your Heart of Corundum, your Blackest Night interventions, oblations, your Nascent Flash, not only to heal people, but to actually mitigate every source of damage possible. This is a reminder, but for parts of the encounter with mechanics where the party takes a lot of damage, tanks are the people in the less danger of dying, so giving extra mitigation to the DPS and healers makes things more comfortable. In those parts of the encounters with multi-hit raid-wides, you can time your reprisals and your Dark Missionary Heart of Light and other mitts to last for multiple hits, and even if you use them a little earlier, you can make it be up for another part of the encounter where it wouldn't be up otherwise, if you use 3 seconds later. As you get more experience as a tank, you can start looking more at the party list, and sometimes you can use your tank mitigation on people that miss something, or to even avoid a death of someone in case of disaster. About the ultimate planning, it is way more important that you don't miss the use of mitigations due to raid wides and busters being mostly guaranteed to kill you if nothing or not enough was used, with hard-hitting transitions have tank limit break being used. If you do plan your cooldowns well with the team, not only the healers will have an easier time, but there's a special case for DSR. You can even allow your team to do different strats, such as a 6-1-1 strat, which makes the last phase way easier for healers. For those who are not familiar with the Dragon Song's Reprise Ultimate, if you don't use your invuln during Double Dragons phase, you should have it up for the last phase, where you can use it to solo the shared buster while the other tank takes a party stack by themselves, and the rest of the party can just take a 3-man stack with 6, making healing much more comfortable and less chance of people dying randomly. And you can also use mitigations for other parts, because the last phase in Dragon Song's Reprise is all on healers and having mitigation plan. But like I said, it requires some planning in the previous phases. The only way to get better at making mitigation plans is by getting more experience with the game and playing more. And if you want to practice more and you are new to the game and to tanking and how to make plans, you can actually practice outside of your raid time with your static. You can practice in Party Finder, Dungeon, Normal Mode, Trials, and all the content existing in the game. And of course, if you're practicing in Normal Mode, Raids, and Trials, and then Dungeons, usually the tank busters and raid wides, they're not gonna hit nowhere near as hard, but at least you can get practice on using your cooldowns. I hope this video helped you learn and understand your role a little bit better. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for future content. If you have any questions or would like to talk, feel free to message me. And thank you all for watching. Until next time.